All right. Good day and good evening to all. Thank you for joining me here. We are situated in 300 AD in Rome. The painting behind me is an 1800s painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme. It is entitled The Christian Martyr's Last Prayer. And it's going to situate us nicely for the reading that we're going to do. This painting depicts, by the way, the Diocletian or Great Persecution, which was the last and most severe persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire. And this is going to go along with the theme. I'm going to be reading from Logos Rising today. Get a lot of requests to read from this book, especially because now E. Michael Jones has been eliminated from the internet. So his books are no longer sold on Amazon. He can no longer be found on YouTube. I believe he is on BitChute, but strange days that we're living in here. So we're going to be reading from chapter 5, which is the beginning of Christianity. I have a playlist of this book that I will link to the description of this video, where I'll work through a few different chapters. Last one I did was a while ago, was chapter 4, which was the history of Logos. And this is an interesting chapter, as it's going to kind of situate us here at around 300 AD, at the time of the rule of the emperor Diocletian. So let's get started here. Chapter 5 is entitled "The Beginning of Christianity: Augustine and the Discovery of Time." So in 378 AD, Fritigern put together an army of Thervings and Grutings and non-Gothic aliens to defeat the Roman legions under Valens in the Battle of Adrianople. By the time Valens fell to the Goths, the Roman Empire had been at war with the Germanic tribes north of the Danube and east of the Rhine for over 3 centuries. In 9 AD, a perfidious German by the name of Arminius lured the Roman legions under Varus into a narrow ravine somewhere beyond the upper reaches of the Leip River, in what is now the German state of Nordrhein-Westfalen. Unable to deploy its military strength because of the terrain, the Roman legion was slaughtered in what was known as the Battle of Teutoburgerwald. As a result, Rome fell back behind Europe's 2 major rivers, west of the Rhine and south of the Danube, using them as natural boundary and line of defense. About 100 years later, the Roman legions added the Dacian kingdom north of the Danube to the empire, but that territorial addition proved untenable because the Welberg culture, of which the Goths were part, began expanding from the Baltic to the south until it finally made contact with the northernmost border of the Roman Empire. After what Peter Heather calls a, quote, fairly straightforward cost-benefit analysis, close quote, the Romans abandoned their plans to expand the empire to the Elbe. The Romans also abandoned their settlements north of the Danube, since the Goths were becoming increasingly difficult to subdue, especially in light of the meager economic return that they provided. By the 3rd century, the northern border of the Roman Empire had fallen back once again to the natural boundaries west of the Rhine and north of the Danube. If you want to see this painting a little bit here. Pretty cool thing. Sorry. By the year 200, the Roman Empire had created a system of assimilation that could integrate every conquered ethnic by teaching him the Latin language and assigning him to the outpost of Roman culture as far as possible from the traditional land of his ethnic origin. A man who had adopted Roman culture could pass from one island of culture to another, all the way from Spain to Persia or from Holland to Egypt, and find people like himself who spoke a uniform common language, who participated in cultural experience based on the literature, art, and philosophy that were, quote, shared by all educated men, close quote. But to get from one island of imperial culture to another, the man had to pass overseas of ethnic, quote unquote, barbarian culture, where people spoke languages like Celtic in France and Syriac in the Mideast, and the Germanic tongues increasingly along the northern borders of the empire. The educated Romans, according to Peter Brown, quote, were notoriously tolerant of race and of local religions, but the price they demanded for inclusion in their own world was conformity, the adoption of its style of life, of its tradition, of its education, and so of his two classical languages, Latin in the West and Greek in the East. Those who were in no position to participate were dismissed. They were frankly despised as quote unquote country bumpkins and quote unquote barbarians. Those who could have participated and those who could have participated and did not, most notably the Jews, were treated with varying degrees of hatred and contempt, only occasionally tempered by respectful curiosity for the representatives of an ancient Near Eastern civilization. Those who had once participated and had ostensibly dropped out, namely the Christians, were liable to summary execution. So you see what's happening right over here. Close quote. Imperial culture, in other words, was the water which made travel between those islands of high classical culture possible. As the sea began to recede, the isolation of those Roman enclaves increased. In addition, a once submerged, more ancient world of ethnic loyalty and culture began to reemerge. The crisis which those ethnic, more ancient cultures provoked arrived in the middle of the 3rd century. The protection which natural boundaries like the Rhine and the Danube provided proved deceptive. One of the greatest achievements of the Roman Empire was the Pax Romana, a Mediterranean world at peace. That world ended in the mid-3rd century with the rise of the Persian Empire in the east in 224, the formation of the Gothic Confederacy in the Danube Basin after 248, and the increasing threat of Germanic tribal inclusion along the Rhine after 260. During the 3rd quarter of the 3rd century, every frontier collapsed under barbarian assault. In 251, the Roman Emperor Decius died in battle fighting the Goths in the marshes of the Dobruja at the mouth of the Danube River. To save the empire, the last remnants of civilian control over the military were abolished. In 260, the Senate was excluded from military commands. Its place was taken by professional soldiers who recast the Roman army, breaking up the unwieldy legions into smaller, more flexible units, which were more effective in dealing with the barbarian raiders. The same military reformers doubled the size of the army, and in doing so, more than doubled its cost. The immediate military crisis was averted only by exchanging it for the long-term problem of how to pay for a military force of over 600,000 men, the largest army the world had ever seen. No one embodied the reforms better than Diocletian, the man from what is now Croatia, who built his palace in Split and visited Rome once in his lifetime. Toward the end of his reign in 300, the civilian population was complaining that there were now more tax collectors than taxpayers in the empire. Sound familiar? The long-term problem of an expansive and expensive military state, which was the solution in the short-term problem of barbarian invasion, would reach its conclusion in the middle of the 5th century when the Roman state went bankrupt and Odovacar, the Goth chieftain the Romans were no longer able to pay off, dismissed Romulus Augustus, the last emperor in the West, and placed the crown on his own head. Diocletian tried to revive the old virtues, largely by persecuting Christians, but by the end of his reign at the turn of the 4th century, quote, the old foci of loyalty had long been found to be either too abstract or too distant, close quote. The magnate of late antiquity spent lavishly on shows and processions, but he spent his money to promote his own personality and social standing, and not for communal religious festivals honoring the traditional gods. The new celebrations emphasized personality over community, and so sent those who attended them off with a dissatisfied feeling and determined to find a community to replace a citizenship that had become increasingly hollow and meaningless. More often than not, those dissatisfied men found meaning for their lives in the, quote, drastic experiment in social living, close quote, that small Christian communities were creating across the length and breadth of the empire. When crisis came, the Roman plebes needed more than old gods could provide. They needed actual communities, grounded in beliefs that went deeper than fables based on obviously anthropomorphic gods, hence the rise of Christianity, and along with it, the rise of other religious-based communities, like the Egyptian cult of Hermes Trismegistus and the Gnostic Manichaean sect that captivated Augustine for a time. Secular culture had gotten too big and too abstract to move the minds and hearts of the people who lived in the cities, which were increasingly lonely and impersonal places. Christianity filled the cultural spaces with which the empire could no longer occupy in the minds of the humble and dispossessed, which included the city's lower middle class after the year 200 AD. The mobility which the empire enabled only accelerated this process. The more opportunity the average Roman had for travel, the more rootless he became. The more rootless, the more he needed a set of beliefs that transcended his local community and a network of communities that embedded those beliefs. Christianity provided both the beliefs and the community that implemented them. The average citizen could avail himself of an even more extensive network of cultural outposts than that available to the average aristocrat. The Christian, according to Brown, quote, could cut some of the more painful Gordian knots of social living. He could, for instance, become a radical cosmopolitan. His literature, his beliefs, his art, and his jargon were extraordinarily uniform, whether he lived in Rome, Lyons, Carthage, or Smyrna. The Christians were immigrants at heart, ideological Darysians, separated from their environment by a belief which they knew they shared with little groups all over the empire. At a time when so many local barriers were being painfully and obscurely eroded, the Christians had already taken the step of calling themselves a quote-unquote non-nation. By focusing their attention on exclusively military matters, the Roman empires created a cultural vacuum which was filled by Christianity and the mystery religions from the East. Being a civis Romanus increasingly meant being little more than a source of funds for the military as it pursued its ends in obscure frontier settlements far to the north. In the cultural vacuum, Christianity appealed to those who felt isolated and deserted by a Leviathan state focused on imperial concerns, far from being home. Being a Christian filled those needs in terms of the doctrine and community. In 250, it meant more to be a Christian than it meant to be a civis Romanus. And as a result, Christianity began to take over the psychic space formerly occupied by secular allegiance. Immigration accelerated the process. Those cut off from their native tribes and adrift in a culture that could no longer propose convincing forms or assimilations outside of the small, still pagan enclaves of high culture could now be integrated without difficulty into the small community, which was the New Israel, the quote-unquote New Israel, which had succeeded in preserving the moral order where the old empire had failed. Galen, according to Brown, quote, noticed that the Christians were apparently enabled by their brutality, simple parables, and commands to live according to the highest maxims of ancient ethics, close quote. Morals then, as always, enabled community to flourish by removing the disruption caused by antisocial behavior. The small Christian community was centered on the Eucharist, but in addition to moral living, it also demanded almsgiving, and those alms, once given, were returned to the less fortunate, with the church and bishop administering the funds, thus strengthening the bonds of the community even further. Doctrine and praxis reinforced each other, and the fruit was community. Quote, the appeal of Christianity still lay in its radical sense of community. It absorbed people because the individual could drop from a wide impersonal world into a miniature community whose demands and relations were explicit, close quote. The resurrection of the term citizen by the Jacobins during the French Revolution was an explicit attempt to return to pre-Christian models. They sought to reverse the Christian development, which led away from abstract secular citizenship into a religious community that began with the rise of Christianity in Rome. Christianity had absorbed the idea of civis Romanus and combined it with the Jewish notion of the quote-unquote true Israel to come, up with the idea of community that provided what the empire lacked, a sense of mutually reinforcing meaning and belonging that did not so much act in opposition to the empire as function under its radar. Because of its coherent doctrine and concern for community, the church was positioned by the end of the 4th century to absorb a society that had become alienated from the concerns of the imperial war machine. Ethnicity, on the other hand, was very much on the empire's radar screen. Ethnicity and Christianity were responses to the fact that being a civis Romanus no longer meant what it had before. Like two islands, which after the water level receded, showed themselves as twin peaks in the same mountain range, religion and ethnicity began to dominate the cultural space, which imperial culture left vacant because of its preoccupation with war. Ethnogenesis began in earnest in 376 when the Huns, moving southwest from their base of operations on the northern coast of the Black Sea, drove unprecedented numbers of Goths across the Danube River into the arms of the bewildered Romans. The two main Gothic groups, the Tervingi and the Grunthungi, felt that asylum under Rome was preferable to extinction at the hands of the Huns. The Huns had set in motion late antiquity's version of the domino effect, which St. Ambrose of Milan noted around 380 when he wrote that, quote, "The Huns threw themselves upon the Alans, and the Alans upon the Goths, and the Goths upon the Taifili and the Sarmati, and this is not yet the end," close quote. The assimilation of new ethnic groups into the Roman Empire had a long tradition. However, it had to be accomplished under certain conditions. Receptio generally meant that a small group of barbarians would be sent to a part of Roman Empire far from the traditional home of their tribe. There, they would be assimilated into the larger Roman culture under the principle of solve et coagula, dissolve and reform. This system broke down under the exigencies of empire. In his History of the Goths, Jordanes claims that they originally came from across a body of water, leading some to speculate that their original home was on the island of Gotland, which is in Scandinavia. They crossed the Baltic and began settlements in what is now Poland and began moving south along the major rivers of that region. Beginning around 150 AD, a large-scale expansion of Wildbark culture took place, which lasted 70 or 80 years. By the middle of the 3rd century, it was over. These tribes had established themselves along the northern Carpathian Mountains and the shores of the Black Sea. Around 200 AD, these tribes came in contact with Rome's northern Dacian frontier. Once they made contact with Roman culture, the Wildbark tribes began to adopt Roman technology and culture, and as a result, their population began to increase. Since Rome still had things which barbarians considered valuable, that population increase meant pressure on Rome to allow migration into the empire and hopefully assimilation as well. The system of receptio began to break down for the same reason the culture of citizenship did, namely military considerations. Just as the demands of an imperial army were destroying the tax base it needed to survive by grinding the small farmer who supported it into penury, so too military exigencies spelled the doom for receptio. Rome found it expedient to use the less and less assimilated Goths where they were needed the most, namely on the borders. It was paying them to defend. That meant that the ethnic groups did not dissolve as they once had during receptio. Rome needed them to defend her borders where they were, which meant that no assimilation was taking place at the very time that the average citizen, far from the war theaters to the north, was losing interest in imperial culture. The war machine may have been necessary to defend Rome's imperial borders, but it was bringing about the cultural destruction of the empire it was supposed to be saving militarily. The army gobbled up money and alienated the people whom it was designed to defend. At the beginning, Roman culture and culture promoted technology and culture promoted assimilation, but contact with other groups enhanced the Goths' sense of ethnic identity. The same was true for Romans. Increased contact simultaneously broke down the old identifications and created new ones. Jerome criticized Roman women, who were obviously impressed with the blonde-haired Goths, for bleaching their hair. In general, the rule of cultural assimilation was fairly simple. As Theodoric put it, the poor Roman wished he were a Goth, whereas the rich Goth wished he were a Roman. Rome had successfully settled hundreds of thousands of ethnic immigrants within its border over its history, but receptio meant that assimilation took place on Roman terms. That meant first military conquest, followed by political subjugation, which usually took place by breaking up the conquered tribes and settling them in wildly dispersed enclaves across the empire. They were then treated with the iron fist or the velvet glove, depending on how they behaved. If they behaved themselves, ethnic groups in the border areas could benefit from trade with outposts of the empire. If they chafed under the yoke of Roman hegemony and gave some indication that they planned to do something about it, they might be surprised by an unexpected visit from one of the nearby military units, which would destroy their village and sell its inhabitants into slavery. All right, that was the end of that first section. I'm going to read one more section. For now, this book is thick and it's tightly packed. So a lot of great information, a lot of historical information, but we get more into the meat of the rise of Christianity here in later sections. So I'm going to read here the collapse of the frontier. In 376, the Romans manning the Danube frontier. Is this working? Yeah. In 376, the Romans manning the Danube frontier of the Roman Empire were faced with a choice. They were too weak to subdue all of the tribes which had been sent in motion by Hunnic expansion, and so they decided to admit the Goths as the lesser of two evils and use them to help defend the northern frontier against the more formidable Huns. To achieve this end, the Romans allowed the Goths to settle en masse without receptio on the southern bank of the Danube River. The man who led the Goths across the Danube was Ulfilas, or Ulfila, the son of a Cappadocian Greeks captured by Goths, who later became their bishop, and after inventing the Gothic alphabet, the man responsible for the translation of the Bible into their native language. Ulfilas was an Arian who believed that the Logos, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, Jesus Christ, was, quote, like the Father, quote, unquote, but not God. Why Ulfilas was an Arian is a matter of dispute. Why Ulfilas was an Arian is a matter of dispute. Arian historians claim that he was part of the heretical sect from childhood. Catholic writers claim that he became an Arian as a result of political pressure after his arrival in Constantinople in 341, when he was consecrated a bishop at the hands of Eusebius of Nicomedia, the Arian bishop of Constantinople. The Catholic Encyclopedia claims, quote, in extenuation of this fault, that Ulfilas was a victim of circumstances because he came under none but Arian and semi-Arian influences during his residence at Constantinople, close quote. According to Cardinal Newman's account of Arianism, quote, was formally detected and condemned, close quote, at the Council of Nicaea in 325, but went on to wreak havoc in the church until the Second General Council of Constantinople in 381, when the, quote, resources of heretical subtlety were at length exhausted, and the Arian party was rejected from the Catholic body and formed into a distinct sect exterior to it, close quote. The subsequent home of that sect was the Gothic peoples, who would eventually displace the Romans as rulers of the West. The National Gothic Church that Ulfilas helped create by endowing it with the vernacular Bible and liturgy was Arian from its inception. When Arianism became part of the national self-consciousness of the Visigoths and of other Germanic peoples, including Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Burgundians, it widened the breach between the Germans and the Romans. The presence of the Arian heresy among the Germanic converts ensured that the transition from the Roman Empire to the Gothic kingdom was not going to be peaceful. Ulfilas tried to find a compromise formula for the hypostatic union at the council, which Theodosius summoned shortly after and becoming emperor at Aquileia in 381. But Ulfilas, quote, persisted in the error until the end of his life, close quote, ensuring, quote, havoc among some of his Teutonic converts, close quote. The Catholic Encyclopedia claims that Arianism rendered the Goths, quote, unable to maintain themselves in the kingdoms which they established, close quote. The issue was Logos. At the critical juncture in history when the Roman Empire was about to end and European civilization had not yet begun, civilization could not proceed on faulty premises. The violence which Arianism spawned while the Roman Empire was still intact proved that. The misunderstanding of Logos at the heart of the Arian heresy became, quote, the animating principle of the second series of persecutions. When the barbarians of the north who were infected with the heresy possessed themselves of the province of the Roman Empire. Arius was a That was close quote. Arius was a presbyter from Alexandria, a city which represented what was best in the tradition of Greek philosophy and a center of Orthodox Catholic thought. When Arius began promulgating his heresy around the year 319, the church recognized his errors and promptly expelled Arius from the city. Arius then found asylum in Antioch, which was equally famous for its toleration of heresy and its Judaizing. Later in the same century, St. John Chrysostom wrote Adverse Iodos, based on his experiences with the Jews in Antioch and his profound understanding of the corrupting effects that Jews had on worldly Christians, who were all too willing to emulate their behavior and adopt their ideas. They played a double game. The Jews, he noted, quote, manifested a rancorous malevolence toward the zealous champions of the church, close quote, while, quote, they courted the Christian populace by arts adapted to captivate and corrupt the unstable and worldly minded. Their presentations to magical power gained them credit with the superstitious, to whom they sold amulets for the cure of diseases. Their noisy spectacles attracted the curiosity of the idle, who weakened their faith, while they disgraced their profession by attending the worship of the synagogue, close quote. Arianism was a manifestation of the traditional Jewish hatred of logos. Arianism originated in the Church of Antioch, which was notorious, as Chrysostom pointed out, for its propensity to Judaizing. Chrysostom, we are told, quote, found this evil so urgent at Antioch in his day as to interpret his course of homilies on the heresy of the Anomoeans in order to direct his preaching against the seductions to which the hearers were then exposed by the return of the Jewish festivals, close quote. Aware of the power of the Jews in Antioch, Arius, newly arrived from Alexandria, confected his heresy as, quote, a kind of Judaism in doctrine, adopted to please his Jewish patrons, close quote. Under Hadrian, the Jews had succeeded in transferring, quote, the violence of Roman persecution, close quote, from themselves and onto the Catholic Church. Freed from persecution, the Jews began to, quote, make proselytize to their creed, at length became an influential political body in the neighborhood of the ancient home, especially in the Syrian provinces, which were at the same time chief residents of the court, close quote. Christians who wanted the favor of the court needed to ally themselves with the Jews. Arianism became a way of taming the uncomfortable demands which the new Christian understanding of the Logos as God made the worldly who accepted its doctrines more in theory than in practice. Quote unquote, Judaizing practice had a corrupting effect on the mind of Christians and, quote, it deserves consideration whether a tendency to derogate from the honor due to Christ was not created by an observance of the Jewish rites, and much more by the carnal self-indulgent religion which seems at that time to have prevailed among the rejected nation, close quote. Freed from persecution, the Jews promoted a Judaism which was, quote, inculcated a superstitious or even idolatrous dependence on the mere casualties of daily life and gave license to the grosser tastes of human nature. It necessarily indisposed the mind for the severe, unexciting mysteries, the large indefinite promises, and the remote sanctions of the Catholic faith, which fell as cold and offensive on the depraved imaginations as the doctrines of the divine unity and of implicit trust in the unseen God on the minds of the early Israelites, close quote. In addition to corrupting the minds of the Christians in Antioch, the Jews lent practical support to the heretics by taking part in all of the, quote, the popular risings which took place in Antioch and Alexandria in favor of Arianism, close quote. They, quote, sided with the heretical party, evincing thereby not indeed by definite interest in the subject of dispute, but as a sort of spontaneous feeling that the side of heresy was their natural position, and further that its spirit and the character which it created were congenial to their own, close quote. The rise of Arianism was a parody of the rise of Christianity. Just as John combined the best of both Hebrew scripture and Greek philosophy in his gospel, Arianism took the worst aspects of both traditions, combining the Jewish hatred of logos with Greek sophistry to create Arianism. Quote, aiming to exhibit the divine nature by means of Aristotelic syllogisms and geometrical data, the Arian heretics are naturally led on to declare that Christ is not this very Son of God, close quote. The fundamental claim of Arianism is that the Son of God was en uk onton, or made of, quote, a substance that once was not, close quote. This meant that the Logos was subject to change. If Christ were the Logos, he was not a person. And if he were a person, Christ was not the Logos, because man changes and the Logos does not. At the hands of the Arians, the Logos reverted to what it was at the time of Aristotle, which is to say, quote, a manifestation, but not a person, close quote. Arianism, quote, agreed with the heresy of Sabellius in considering God to exist only in one person, and his Logos to be but an attribute manifested in the Son, who was a creature, close quote. If the Son is not God, then his holiness, quote, was not essential, but acquired, close quote. If the Son is, this meant that he was capable of sin. If Jesus could sin, he could defect from the mission assigned to him by the Father, and if he could do that, there was no secure foundation of the universe in Arianism. This lack of sure foundation in the metaphysical order doomed the Gothic kingdom to extinction because it was founded on the program of a party which, quote, had no fixed tenet except that of opposition to the true notion of Christ's divinity, and whose teaching, accordingly, had no firm footing, close quote. The fact that Logos is universal means that, quote, there is something true and divinely revealed in every religion all over the earth, overloaded as it may be, and at times even stifled by the impieties which the corrupt will and understanding of man have incorporated with it. Such are the doctrines of the power and presence an invisible God, of his moral law and governance, of the obligation of duty and the certainty of a last judgment, and of reward and punishment being dispensed in the end to individuals, so that revelation, properly speaking, is a universal, not a partial gift. And the distinction between the state of Israelites formerly and Christians now and that of the heathens is not that we can and they cannot attain to future blessedness, but that the church of God ever has had and the rest of mankind never have had authoritative documents. Close quote. Heresy, by definition, means choosing the part over the whole. The danger arrives when the Jews and the Greeks chose the partial version of the Logos with which they were familiar over the revelation of a more complete understanding which does not suit their preconceived notions. Philo combined Jewish and Greek errors about the nature of Logos in his writings. Crippled by the inadequacies of the Hebrew scriptures and Platonic thought, Philo separated, quote, the idea of the Logos from that of the eternal God, and so perhaps to prepare the way for Arianism, close quote. Both schools united under the reign of Julian the Apostate. The Jews collaborated with Julian in their disastrous attempt to rebuild the temple, and the Greeks collaborated with him in making philosophy the rival of Christianity. Under Julian, the eclectic school of philosophy, quote, usurped the theological chair as an interpreter of sacred duties and the instructor of the inquiring mind. Under Julian, quote, a crowd of poets, of rhetoricians, and philosophers hastened to the imperial court to occupy the vacant places of the bishops who had seduced the credulity of Constantius, close quote. Contemporary authors ascribed the rise of Arianism, quote, partially to Judaism and eclecticism, and more expressly to the influence of the Sophists, that Alexander of Alexandria, to whose lot it fell first to withstand it, refers us once to Antioch and as its original seat, to Judaism as its ultimate source, and to the subtleties of disputation as the instrument of its exhibition, close quote. Heresy is always the same. Striking an especially modern note, Alexander of Alexandria accused Arius of, quote, employing women in his disturbance of the church, close quote. The church, on the other hand, refused to abandon its commitment to Logos, even when her ministries lacked the precise vocabulary to describe its latest manifestation in history, the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Christ was in some analogous sense Plato's demiurge, but to be that he had to be both true God and true man. Under the scriptural appellation, Son of God, Jesus Christ, the Logos incarnate, quote, appears to possess such strict personal attributes as to be able voluntarily to descend from heaven and assume our nature without ceasing to be identically that he was before, what he was before. So as to speak of himself, though a man, as one and the same with the divine word who existed in the beginning, close quote. The God who is eternal does not change, but as Gregory Nazianzen put it, quote, Almighty God has in the course of his dispensations changed the ritual of religion by successive abrogations. So he has changed its theology by continual additions till it has come to perfection. Quote, under the old dispensation, he proceeds, the Father was openly revealed and the Son but obscurely. When the new was given, the Son was manifested, but the divinity of the Spirit intimated only. Now, after Pentecost, the Spirit dwells with us, affording us clear evidence about himself. Thus, by gradual additions and flights, as David says, from strength to strength and from glory to glory, the radiance of the Trinity has been made to shine out on us in proportion as our increasing strength of vision was able to bear it. Close quote. The clearest exposition of the relationship of Father and Son comes in the prologue to the Gospel of St. John, when the evangelist says that the Logos was both God and with God. Jesus is, quote, one with, yet personally separate from God. The Greek concept of ousia being, clarifies what John said when he claimed that the Logos was both God and with God, because, quote, it clears up all doubts as to the existence of God as separate from and independent of nature, and shows us that the course of the world depends not merely on a system, but on a being, real, living individual. But we ourselves witness evidences to us the operation of laws, physical and moral. But it leaves uncertain whether or not the principle of these be a mere nature or fate, whether the life of all things be mere animal mundi, a spirit connatural with the body in which it acts, or an agent powerful to make or unmake or change or supersede according to his will. It is here that revelation supplies the deficiency of philosophical religion. Miracles are its emblem, as well as its credentials, forcing on the imagination the existence of an irresponsible, self-dependent being, as well as recommending a particular message to the reason. This great truth, conveyed in the very circumstances under which revelation was given, is explicitly recognized in its doctrine. Among other modes of inculcating it may be named the appellation under which Almighty God disclosed himself to the Israelites. Jehovah, or as the Septuagints translate Toon, being an expressive appellation of him, who is essentially separate from those variable and perishable substances which creation presents to our observation. Accordingly, the description of the Supreme Being, Toon, or in other words, the doctrine of the ousia of God, became familiar to the minds of the primitive Christians as embodying the spirit of the scriptures and indirectly witnessing against the characteristic error of pagan philosophy, which considered the divine mind not as a reality, but as a mere abstract name or generalized law of nature, or at best a mere mode, principle, or an animating soul, not a being external to creation and possessed of individuality, close quote. The God of the heretics, Justin Martyr points out, quote, put forth and withdrew his logos when it pleased him, as if he were an influence, not a person, close quote. The God of the Orthodox, on the other hand, is constant like the sun. Like the sun, quote, the substance, ousia, of the Son is not external to the Father or created, but it is by natural derivation from that of the Father, as the radiance comes from light. For as the radiance is not the sun, and yet not foreign to it, so is there an effluence, aporia, for the Father substance, ousia, though it is indivisible. For as the sun remains the same without infringement of its nature, though it pour forth its radiance, so the Father's substance is unchangeable, though the Son be its image. Close quote. The Son, according to Hippolytus, stood by the Father, quote, not as if there were two gods, but as though light from light, or ray from the sun, close quote. If, as Arius argued, Jesus Christ were the Son and, quote, therefore not God, the Logos would have been a plan without an executor. Since Jesus Christ is God, he has the power to put the plan, which is Logos, into action and bring it to its complete fulfillment according to divine providence and the power of God. The ultimate reality is not just a plan, it is a being as well. Quote, it is plain, Gregory Nazian continues, that those designs which the Father conceives, the Word fulfills, not as a servant or not entering into them, but with full knowledge and a master's power, and, to speak more suitably, as if he were the Father. Close quote. Revelation clears up the philosophical conundrum which the Greeks could not solve on their own. The Logos is not just a plan, it is a person as well, the second person of the Trinity, and therefore able to fulfill in history the plan which the Logos proposes in eternity. All right, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for listening.